The Fisherman and the Genie. From the Arabian Nights. There was once an old fisherman who lived in great poverty with a wife and 3 children. But though poorer than others, he ever toiled in humble submission to the decrees of Providence, and so, at the same hour each day, he would cast his net 4 times into the sea, and whatever it brought up to him therewith, he rested content. One day, having cast for the first time, he found his net so heavy that he could scarcely draw it in. Yet when at last he got it to shore, all that it contained was the carcass of an ass. He cast a second time, and found the draught of the net even heavier than before. But again he was doomed to disappointment, for this time it contained nothing but a large earthenware jar full of mud and sand. His third attempt brought him only a heap of broken old bottles and potsherds. Fortune seemed to be against him. Then, committing his hope to Providence, he cast for the fourth and last time, and once more the weight of the net was so great that he was unable to haul it. When at last he got it to land, he found that it contained a brazen vessel, its mouth closed with a leaden stopper, bearing upon it the seal of King Solomon. The sight cheered him. "This," thought he, "I can sell in the market, where I may get for it enough to buy a measure of corn, and, if one is to judge by weight, what lies within may prove yet more valuable." Thus reckoning, he prized out the stopper with his knife, and turning the vessel upside down, looked for the contents to follow. Great was his astonishment when nothing but smoke came out of it. The smoke rose in a thick black column and spread like a mist between earth and sky, till presently, drawing together, it took form, and there in its midst stood a mighty genie, whose brows touched heaven while his feet rested upon ground. His head was like a dome, his hands were like flails, and his legs like pine trees. His mouth was black as a cavern, his nostrils were like trumpets, his eyes blazed like torches, and his wings whirled round and over him like the simoom of the desert. At so fearful a sight, all the fisherman's courage oozed out of him. But the genie, perceiving him, cried with a loud voice, "O Solomon, prophet of God, slay me not, for never again will I withstand thee in word or deed." "Alas," said the fisherman, "I am no prophet, and as for Solomon, he has been dead for nearly 2,000 years. I am but a poor fisherman whom chance has knocked by accident against thy door." "In that case," answered the genie, "know that presently thou wilt have to die." "Heaven forbid," cried the fisherman, "or at least tell me why. Surely it might seem that I had done thee some service in releasing thee." "Hear first my story," said the genie, "then shalt thou understand." "Well, if I must," said the fisherman, resigning himself to the inevitable, "but make it short, for truly I have small stomach left in me now for the hearing of tales." "Know, then," said the genie, "that I am one of those spirits which resisted the power and dominion of Solomon, and when, having brought into submission all the rest of my race, he could not make me yield to him either reverence or service, he caused me to be shut up in this bottle, and sealing it with his own seal, cast it down into the depths of the sea. Now when I had lain there prisoner for 100 years, I swore in my heart that I would give to the man that should release me all the treasures attainable in heaven or earth. But when none came to earn so great a reward in all the 100 years that followed, then I swore that I would give to my liberator earthly riches only. And when this gift also had lain despised for yet another 100 years, then would I promise no more than the fulfillment of 3 wishes. But thereafter, finding that all promises and vows were vain, my heart became consumed with rage, and I swore by Allah that I would only grant to the fool that should release me his own choice of the most cruel form of death by which he should die. Now therefore accept that mercy which I still offer, and choose thy penalty." When the fisherman heard this, he gave himself up for lost, yet he did not the less continue by prayer and supplication to entreat the genie from his purpose. But when he found that there was no heart left in him to be moved, then for the first time he bestirred his wits, and remembering how that which is evil contains far less wisdom than that which is good, and so falls ever the more readily into the trap prepared for it, he spoke thus: O Genie, since thou art determined on my death, there is yet a certain thing touching thine honour that I would first know. So, by the ineffable name, which is the seal of Solomon, I will ask thee one question, and do thou swear to answer it truly. The genie was ready enough to give the oath as desired. Then said the fisherman, How is it that one so great as thou art, whose feet o'erstep the hills and whose head outtops the heaven, how can such an one enter into so small a vessel to dwell in it? Truly, though mine eyes tell me I have seen it, I cannot any longer believe so great a marvel. What? Cried the genie. Dost thou not believe what I have already told thee? Not till I have seen it done can I believe it, said the fisherman. Thereupon, without more waste of words, the genie, drawing his limbs together and folding himself once more in a thick veil of smoke, descended from his vast altitude into the narrow neck of the brazen vessel till not one shred or film of him remained to view. Then the fisherman, with a quick hand, replaced the leaden stopper, and laughing, cried to the genie, Choose now thou in thy turn, by what manner of death thou wilt die. The genie, hearing himself thus mocked, made violent efforts to escape, but the power of the seal of Solomon held him fast, and the fisherman, ceasing not all the while to revile him for the treachery and baseness which were now to receive their due reward, began to carry the vessel back to the sea's brink. Now, said he, thou shalt return to the place whence I drew thee, and here on the shore I will build myself a hut, and to every fisherman that comes near I will say, Look that you fish not in these waters, for herein lies bound a wicked genie that has sworn to put to a cruel death whoever dares to release him. Nay, nay, cried the genie, I did not mean what I said. Ask of me now, and I will give you all the treasures that the world contains, or that your heart can find in it to desire, if only you will set me free. The fisherman, being of a mild spirit and with no heart for revenge, sat down to consider what he should do, and all the while the imprisoned genie continued to appeal to him for compassion with loud promise and lamentation. So at last the fisherman, having the fear of God before his eyes, after he had extracted from the genie a most solemn vow to leave him unharmed, drew out the stopper of lead and released him. No sooner was he out and restored to his true form than the genie, turning himself about, lifted his foot, and with his full strength smote the brazen vessel far out to sea, and the fisherman, beholding that act, began to repent him of his mercy and to tremble again for dear life. But the genie, seeing his fear, broke into huge laughter, and striding on ahead of him, cried, Come, fisherman, and follow me, for now I will lead you to fortune. Meekly at his heels went the old fisherman, and leaving behind them the habitations of men, they ascended a mountain and entered upon a desert tract guarded by 4 hills, in the centre of which lay a broad lake. Here the genie stopped, and pointing to a place where fish were swimming in abundance, bade the fisherman cast in his net. The fisherman did as he was told, and when he drew in his net, he found that it contained 4 fish, each of a different colour, a red, a white, a blue, and a yellow. Never in his life had he seen the like of them. The genie bade him take and offer them to the sultan, assuring him that if he did so, they should bring him both fortune and honours. Then he struck the ground with his foot, and immediately the earth opened its mouth and swallowed him as the dry desert swallows the rain. The fisherman, wondering no less at his safe deliverance than at the marvel of these occurrences, made his way in haste to the city, and there, presenting himself at the palace, he begged that the 4 fish might be laid at the sultan's feet as a humble offering from the poorest of his subjects. No sooner had the monarch seen them, so strange of form and so brilliant and diverse in hue, than his longing to taste of them became strongly awakened. So, by the hand of his vizier, he sent them to the cook to be prepared forthwith for the royal table. As for the poor fisherman, he received no fewer than 400 pieces of gold from the sultan's bounty, and returned to his family rejoicing in an affluence which surpassed his utmost expectations. The cook, meanwhile, proud of an opportunity to exhibit her culinary skill on dainties so rare, scaled and cleaned the fish and laid them in a frying pan over the fire. But scarcely had she done so when the wall of the kitchen divided, and there issued forth from it a damsel of moon-like beauty, richly apparelled, holding a rod of myrtle in her hand. With this she struck the fish that lay in the frying pan and cried, "O fish of my pond, are ye true to your bond?" And immediately the four fishes lifted their heads from the frying fat and answered, "Even so, the bond holds yet. Paid by thee, we pay the debt. With give and take is the reckoning met." Thereupon the damsel upset the pan into the fire and retired through the wall in the same way that she had come, leaving the four fish all charred to a cinder. The cook, beholding her labour thus brought to naught, began to weep and bewail herself, expecting no less than instant dismissal, and was still loud in her lamentations when the vizier arrived to see if the fish were ready. On hearing her account of what had occurred, the vizier was greatly astonished, but feared to bring so strange a report to the sultan's ears while the cravings of the royal appetite were still unsatisfied. So recalling the fisherman by a swift messenger, he bade him procure in all haste 4 more fish of the same kind, promising to reward him according to the speed with which he accomplished the task. So spurred, and by the additional favour of fortune, the fisherman fulfilled his mission in an astonishingly short space of time. But no sooner was the second lot of fish placed upon the fire in the vizier's presence than once again the wall opened, and the damsel, appearing as before, struck the frying pan with her rod and cried, "O fish of my pond, are ye true to your bond?" And immediately the fish stood up on their tails in the frying fat and replied, "Even so the bond holds yet. Paid by thee, we pay the debt. With give and take is the reckoning met." Whereupon she upset the pan into the fire and departed as she had come. The vizier, perceiving that so strange an event might no longer be kept from the royal knowledge, went and informed the sultan of all that had occurred, and the monarch, as soon as he had heard the tale, now rendered more eager for the satisfaction of his eyes than he had previously been for the indulgence of his appetite, sent for the fisherman, and promised him yet another 400 pieces of gold if he could within a given time procure 4 more fishes, similar to those he had already brought on the previous occasions. If the fisherman had been prompt at the vizier's bidding, he made even greater speed to fulfill the royal command, and before the day was over, this time in the presence of the sultan himself, 4 fish, of 4 diverse colours like to the first, were cleaned and laid into the pan ready for frying. But scarcely had they touched the fat when the wall opened in a clap like thunder, and there came forth with a face of rage a monstrous negro the size of a bull, holding in his hand the rod of myrtle. With this he struck the frying pan and cried in a terrible voice, "O fish from the pond, are ye true to your bond?" And when the fish had returned the same answer that the others had made before them, without more ado, the negro overturned the pan upon the fire and departed as he had come. When the sultan's eyes had seen that marvel, he said to his vizier, "Here is mystery set before us. Surely these fish that talk have a past and a history. Never shall I rest satisfied until I have learned it." So causing the fisherman to be brought before him, he inquired whence the fish came. The fisherman answered, "From a lake between 4 hills upon the mountain overlooking the city." The sultan inquired how many days' journey it might be, and the fisherman replied that it was but a matter of a few hours going and returning. Then to the sultan and his court it seemed that the old man was mocking them, for none had heard tell of any lake lying among the hills so near to that city. And the fisherman, seeing his word doubted, began to fear that the genie was playing him a trick, for if the lake were now suddenly to vanish away, he might find his fortunes more undone at the end than at the beginning. Yet the sultan, though his vizier and all his court sought to dissuade him, was firmly resolved on putting the matter to the proof, so he gave orders that an escort and camping tents should be immediately got ready, and, with the fisherman to guide, set forth to find the place that was told of. And sure enough, when they had ascended the mountain which all knew, they came upon a desert tract on which no man had previously set eyes. And there in its midst lay the lake filled with 4 kinds of fish, and beyond it stretched a vast and unknown country. At this sight, so mysterious and unaccountable, of a strange region lying unbeknownst at the gates of his own capital, the monarch was seized with an overwhelming desire to press forward in solitary adventure to the discovery of its secret. To the cautious counsels of his vizier he turned a deaf ear, but since it would not be safe for his subjects to know of his departure on an errand so perilous, it was given out that he had been stricken by sudden sickness. The door of the royal tent was closed, and at the dead of night the Sultan, admitting none but the vizier into his confidence, set out secretly on his adventure. Journeying by night and resting by day, he arrived on the 3rd morning within sight of a palace of shining marble, which, with its crowd of domes and minarets, stood solitary among the hills. No sign of life was about it, and when he drew near and knocked at the gates, none came to answer him. Then, finding the doors unfastened, he took courage and entered, and advancing through chambers where gold lay as dust, and by fountains wherein pearls lay poured out like water, he found only solitude to greet him. Wandering without aim among innumerable treasures unguarded and left to waste, the Sultan grew weary and sat down in an embrasure to rest. Then it seemed to him that not far off he could hear a sorrowful voice chant verses of lamentation. Following the sounds with wonder, he came to a curtained doorway, and passing through found himself in the presence of a fair youth richly dressed, seated upon a couch and bearing upon his countenance tokens of extreme grief and despondency. To the Sultan's proffered greeting, the youth returned salutation, but did not stir from his seat. "Pardon me," he said, "for not rising, but my miserable condition makes it impossible." Having said this, he again broke into doleful lamentation, and when the Sultan inquired as to the cause of so many tears, "See for yourself," he cried, "what I am now made into." And lifting the skirt of his robe, he revealed himself all stone from his waist to the soles of his feet, while from the waist upwards he was as other men. Then, as he observed upon his visitor's countenance the expression of a lively curiosity and astonishment, "Doubtless," he went on, "as you now know the secret of my miserable condition, you will wish also to hear my story." And he related it as follows. The story of the King of the Ebony Isles. My father was king of the city which once stood about this palace. He was lord also of the Ebony Isles, that are now the 4 hills which you passed on your way hither. When I succeeded to the throne upon his death, I took to wife my own cousin, the daughter of my uncle, with whom I lived for 5 years in the utmost confidence and felicity, continually entertained by the charm of her conversation and the beauty of her person, and happy in the persuasion that she found in me an equal satisfaction. One day, however, it chanced, in the hour before dinner, when the queen was gone to bathe and adorn herself, that I lay upon a couch beside which 2 female slaves sat fanning me, and they, supposing me to be asleep, began to talk concerning me and their mistress. "Ah," said one, "how little our lord knows where our mistress goes to amuse herself every night while he lies dreaming." "How should he know?" returned the other, "seeing that the cup of wine which she gives him each night contains a sleeping draught that causes him to sleep sound however long she is absent. Then, at daybreak, when she returns, she burns perfumes under his nostrils, and he, waking and finding her there, guesses nothing. Pity it is that he cannot know of her treacherous ways, for surely it is a shame that a king's wife should go abroad and mix with base people." Now, when I heard this, the light of day grew dark before my eyes, but I lay on and made no sign, awaiting my wife's return. And she coming in presently, we sat down and ate and drank together according to custom. And afterwards, when I had retired and lain down, she brought me with her own hands the cup of spiced wine, inviting me to drink. Then I, averting myself, raised it to my lips, but instead of drinking, poured it by stealth into my bosom, and immediately sank down as though overcome by its potency, feigning slumber. Straightway the queen rose up from my side, and having clothed herself in gorgeous apparel and anointed herself with perfumes, she made her way secretly from the palace, and I, with equal secrecy, followed her. Soon, passing by way of the narrower streets, we arrived before the city gates, and immediately at a word from her the chains fell, and the gates opened of their own accord, closing again behind us as soon as we had passed. At last she came to a ruined hut, and there entering I saw her presently with her veil laid aside, seated in familiar converse with a monstrous negro, the meanest and most vile of slaves, offering to him in abject civility dainties which she had carried from the royal table, and bestowing upon him every imaginable token of affection and regard. At this discovery I fell into a blind rage, and drawing my sword I rushed in and struck the slave from behind a blow upon the neck that should have killed him. Then, believing that I had verily slain him, and before the queen found eyes to realize what had befallen, I departed under cover of night as quickly as I had come, and returned to the palace and my own chamber. On awaking the next morning, I found the queen lying beside me as though nothing had happened, and at first I was ready to believe it had all been an evil dream. But presently I perceived her eyes red with weeping, her hair dishevelled, and her face torn by the passion of a grief which she strove to conceal. Having thus every reason to believe that my act of vengeance had not fallen short of its purpose, I held my tongue and made no sign. But the same day at noon, while I sat in council, the queen appeared before me clad in deep mourning, and with many tears informed me how she had received sudden news of the death of her father and mother and two brothers, giving full and harrowing details of each event. Without any show of incredulity, I heard her tale, and when she besought my permission to go into retirement and mourn in a manner befitting so great a calamity, I bade her do as she desired. So for a whole year she continued to mourn in a privacy which I left undisturbed, and during that time she caused to be built a mausoleum or temple of lamentation, the same whose dome you see yonder, into which she withdrew herself from all society, while I, believing the cause of my anger removed and willing to humour the grief which my act had caused her, waited patiently for her return to a sane and reasonable state of mind. But as I learned too late, matters had not so fallen, for though in truth the negro was grievously wounded, being cut through the gullet and speechless, it was not the will of heaven that he should die. And the queen, having by her enchantments kept him in a sort of life, no sooner was the mausoleum finished than she caused him to be secretly conveyed thither, and there night and day tended him, awaiting his full recovery. At length, when 2 years were over, and her mourning in no wise abated, my curiosity became aroused. So going one day to the Temple of Lamentation, I entered unannounced, and placing myself where I might see and not be seen, there I discovered her in an abandonment of fond weeping over her miserable treasure, whose very life was a dishonour to us both. But no sooner in my just resentment had I started to upbraid her, than she, as now for the first time realizing the cause of her companion's misfortune, began to heap upon me terms of the most violent and shameful abuse. And when, carried beyond myself, I threatened her with my sword, she stood up before me, and having first uttered words of unknown meaning, she cried, "Be thou changed in a moment's span, half be marble and half be man." And at the word I became even as you see me now, dead to the waist, and above living yet bound. Yet even so her vengeance was not satisfied. Having reduced me to this state, she went on to vent her malice upon the city and islands over which I ruled, and the unfortunate people who were my subjects. Thus, by her wicked machinations, the city became a lake, and the islands about it the 4 hills which you have seen. As for the inhabitants, who were of 4 classes and creeds, Moslems, Christians, Jews, and Persians, she turned them into fish of 4 different colours. The white are the Moslems, the red are Persian fire worshippers, the yellow are Jews, and the blue Christians. And now, having done all this, she fails not every day to inflict upon me 100 lashes with a whip which draws blood at every stroke. And when these are accomplished, she covers my torn flesh with haircloth, and lays over it these rich robes in mockery. Of a surety it is the will of heaven that I should be the most miserable and despised of mortals. Thus the youth finished his story, nor when he had ended could he refrain from tears. The Sultan also was greatly moved when he heard it, and his heart became full of a desire to avenge such injuries upon the doer of them. "Tell me," he said, "where is now this monster of iniquity?" "Sir," answered the youth, "I doubt not she is yonder in the mausoleum with her companion, for thither she goes daily so soon as she has measured out to me my full meed of chastisement, and as for this day my portion has been served to me, I am quit of her till tomorrow brings the hour of fresh scourgings." Now, when this was told him, the Sultan saw his way plain. "Be of good cheer," he said to the youth, "and endure with a quiet spirit yet once more the affliction she causes thee, for at the price of that single scourging I trust, by the will of heaven, to set thee free." So on the morrow the Sultan lay in close hiding until sounds reached him which told that the whippings had begun. Then he arose and went in haste to the mausoleum, where amid rich hangings and perfumes and the illumination of 1,000 candles, he found the black slave stretched mute upon a bed, awaiting in great feebleness the recovered use of his sawn gullet. Quickly, with a single sword stroke, the avenger took from him that poor remnant of life which enchantment alone had made possible. Then, having thrown the body into a well in the courtyard below, he lay down in the dead man's place, drawing the coverlet well over him. Soon after, fresh from her accustomed task of cruelty, the enchantress entered, and falling upon her knees beside the bed, she cried, "Has my lord still no voice wherewith to speak to his servant? Surely, for lack of that sound, hearing lies withered within me." Then the Sultan, taking to himself the thick speech of a Negro, said, "There is no strength or power but in God alone." On hearing those words, believing that her companion's speech was at last restored to him, the Queen uttered a cry of joy. But scarcely had she begun to lavish upon him the tokens of her affection, when the pretended Negro broke out against her in violent abuse. "What?" he cried. "Dost thou expect favour at my hands, when it is because of thee that for 2 years I have lain dumb and prostrate? How darest thou speak to me, or look for any recompense save death? Nay," he went on in answer to her astonished protests, "have not the cries and tears and groans of thy husband kept me continually from rest? And has not heaven smitten me for no other reason than because thou wouldst not cease from smiting him? So has the curse which thou didst seek to lay upon him fallen doubly upon me." "Alas," cried the enchantress, "have I unknowingly caused thee so great an ill? If it be so, then let my lord give command, and whatever be his desire, it shall be satisfied." Then said the Sultan, "Go instantly and release thy husband from spell and torment, and when it is done, return hither with all speed." Thus compelled, in great fear and bewilderment, and sorely against her will, the Queen sped to the chamber in the palace where her husband lay spellbound. Taking a vessel of water, she pronounced over it certain words which caused it instantly to boil, as though it had been set on a fire. Then, throwing the water over him, she cried, "Spell be loosed, and stone grow warm, yield back flesh to the human form." And immediately on the word, his nature came to him again, and he leaped and stood upon his feet. But the Queen's hatred towards him was by no means abated. "Go hence quickly," she cried, "since a better will than mine releases thee. But if thou tarry, or if thou return, thou shalt surely die." Thankful for his deliverance, the youth stayed not to question, but departing went and hid himself without, while the Queen returned in haste to the mausoleum where her supposed lover awaited her. There, Eager for restoration to favour, she informed him of what she had done, supposing that to be all. "Nay," said the other, still speaking with the thick voice of a negro, "though thou hast lopped the branch of the evil, thou hast not destroyed the root. For every night I hear a jumping of fishes in the lake that is between the 4 hills, and the sound of their curses on thee and me comes to disturb my rest. Go instantly and restore all things to their former state. Then come back and give me thy hand, and I shall rise up a sound man once more." Rejoicing in that promise and the expectations it held out to her of future happiness, the queen went with all speed to the border of the lake. There taking a little water into her hand, and uttering strange words over it, she sprinkled it this way and that upon the surface of the lake and the roots of the 4 hills, and immediately where had been the lake, a city appeared, and instead of fishes inhabitants, and in place of the 4 hills 4 islands. As for the palace, it stood no longer removed far away into the desert, but upon a hill overlooking the city. Great was the astonishment of the vizier and the sultan's escort, which had lain encamped beside the lake, to find themselves suddenly transported to the heart of a populous city, with streets and walls and the hum of reawakened life around them. But a greater and more terrible shock than this awaited the queen upon her return to the mausoleum to enjoy the reward of her labours. "Now," she cried, "let my lord arise, since all that he willed is accomplished." "Give me thy hand," said the Sultan, still in a voice of disguise. "Come nearer that I may lean on thee." And as she approached, he drew forth his sword, which had lain concealed beside him in the bed, and with a single blow cleft her wicked body in twain. Then he rose and went quickly to where in hiding lay the young king, her husband, who learned with joy of the death of his cruel enemy. He thanked the Sultan with tears of gratitude for his deliverance, and invoked the blessings of heaven upon him and his kingdom. "On yours too," said the Sultan. "Let peace and prosperity now reign. And since your city is so near to mine, come with me and be my guest, that we may rejoice together in the bonds of friendship." "Nay," answered the young king, "that would I do willingly, but your country lies many a day's journey from my own. I fear the breaking of the spell which held me and my subjects has brought you further than you wished." It was in fact true that the Ebony Isles had now returned to the place from which they had originally come. The Sultan put a smiling face upon the matter. "I can well put up with the tedium of my journey," said he, "if only you will be my companion. Nay, let me speak frankly to one whose demeanour in affliction has won my heart. I am childless and have no heir. Come with me and be my son, and when I am dead, unite our 2 kingdoms under a single ruler." The young king, who had conceived for his deliverer an equal affection, could not withstand so noble and generous an offer, and so, with a free exchange of hearts on both sides, the matter was arranged. After a journey of some months, the Sultan arrived again at his own capital, where he was welcomed with great rejoicings by the people, who had long mourned over his strange and unexplained absence. As for the old fisherman who had been the immediate cause of the young king's deliverance, the Sultan loaded him with honours, and gave his daughters in marriage to sons of the blood royal, so that they all continued in perfect happiness and contentment to the end of their days. The Monkey's Paw. 1. Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlour of Laburnum Villa the blinds were drawn, and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess, the former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the latter, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check." "I should hardly think that he'd come tonight," said his father, with his hand poised over the board. "Mate," replied the son. "That's the worst of living so far out," bawled Mr. White, with sudden and unlooked-for violence. "Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Pathways a bog, and the roads a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses in the road are let, they think it doesn't matter." "Never mind, dear," said his wife soothingly. "Perhaps you'll win the next one." Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin grey beard. "There he is," said Herbert White, as the gate banged to loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said, "Tut, tut," and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing him. The sergeant major shook hands, and taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host got out whiskey and tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. At the third glass his eyes got brighter, and he began to talk, the little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange peoples. 21 years of it," said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. "When he went away, he was a slip of a youth in the warehouse. Now look at him." "He don't look to have taken much harm," said Mrs. White politely. "I'd like to go to India myself," said the old man, "just to look round a bit, you know." "Better where you are," said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and, sighing softly, shook it again. "I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers," said the old man. "What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris?" "Nothing," said the soldier hastily. "Leastways nothing worth hearing." "Monkey's paw," said Mrs. White curiously. "Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps," said the sergeant major offhandedly. His 3 listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. His host filled it for him. "To look at," said the sergeant major, fumbling in his pocket. "It's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy." He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. "And what is there special about it?" inquired Mr. White as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it upon the table. "It had a spell put on it by an old fakir," said the sergeant major, "a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it." His manner was so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat. "Well, why don't you have 3, sir?" said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him in the way that middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth. "I have," he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. "And did you really have the 3 wishes granted?" asked Mrs. White. "I did," said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. "And has anybody else wished?" persisted the old lady. "The first man had his 3 wishes." "Yes," was the reply. "I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw." His tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group. "If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris," said the old man at last. "What do you keep it for?" The soldier shook his head. "Fancy, I suppose," he said slowly. "I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale. Some of them, and those who do think anything of it, want to try it first and pay me afterward. If you could have another 3 wishes, said the old man, eyeing him keenly, would you have them? I don't know, said the other. I don't know. He took the paw and, dangling it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. Better let it burn, said the soldier solemnly. If you don't want it, Morris, said the other, give it to me. I won't, said his friend, doggedly. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again like a sensible man. The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely. How do you do it? He inquired. Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud, said the sergeant major. But I warn you of the consequences. Sounds like the Arabian Nights, said Mrs. White, as she rose and began to set the supper. Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me? Her husband drew the talisman from pocket, and then all 3 burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. If you must wish, he said gruffly, wish for something sensible. Mr. White dropped it back in his pocket and, placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the 3 sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second installment of the soldier's adventures in India. If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us, said Herbert, as the door closed behind their guest, just in time for him to catch the last train, we shan't make much out of it. Did you give him anything for it, father? Inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely. A trifle, said he, colouring slightly. He didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away. Likely, said Herbert, with pretended horror. Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with. Then you can't be henpecked. He darted round the table, pursued by the maligned Mrs. White, armed with an antimacassar. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact, he said slowly. It seems to me I've got all I want. If you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you? Said Herbert, with his hand on his shoulder. Well, wish for £200 then. That'll just do it. His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman, as his son, with a solemn face, somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords. I wish for £200, said the old man distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him. It moved, he cried, with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. As I wished. It twisted in my hand like a snake. Well, I don't see the money, said his son, as he picked it up and placed it on the table, and I bet I never shall. It must have been your fancy, father, said his wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head. Never mind, though. There's no harm done, but it gave me a shock all the same. They sat down by the fire again while the 2 men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. A silence unusual and depressing settled upon all 3, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night. I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed, said Herbert, as he bade them good night, and something horrible squatting up on top of the wardrobe watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains. He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that with a little uneasy laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver, he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. 2. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning as it streamed over the breakfast table, he laughed at his fears. There was an air of prosaic wholesomeness about the room which it had lacked on the previous night, and the dirty, shriveled little paw was pitched on the sideboard with a carelessness which betokened no great belief in its virtues. "I suppose all old soldiers are the same," said Mrs. White. "The idea of our listening to such nonsense! How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could £200 hurt you, father?" "Might drop on his head from the sky," said the frivolous Herbert. "Morris said the things happened so naturally," said his father, "that you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence." "Well, don't break into the money before I come back," said Herbert, as he rose from the table. "I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, avaricious man, and we shall have to disown you." His mother laughed, and following him to the door, watched him down the road, and returning to the breakfast table, was very happy at the expense of her husband's credulity, all of which did not prevent her from scurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor prevent her from referring somewhat shortly to retired sergeant majors of bibulous habits when she found that the post brought a tailor's bill. "Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home," she said, as they sat at dinner. "I dare say," said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer. "But for all that, the thing moved in my hand, that I'll swear to." "You thought it did," said the old lady soothingly. "I say it did," replied the other. "There was no thought about it. I had just, 'What's the matter?'" His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the £200, she noticed that the stranger was well dressed and wore a silk hat of glossy newness. 3 times he paused at the gate and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then, with sudden resolution, flung it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White at the same moment placed her hands behind her and, hurriedly unfastening the strings of her apron, put that useful article of apparel beneath the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed at her furtively and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologized for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, a garment which he usually reserved for the garden. She then waited as patiently as her sex would permit for him to broach his business, but he was at first strangely silent. "I was asked to call," he said at last, and stooped and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers. "I come from Moore and Meggins." The old lady started. "Is anything the matter?" she asked, breathlessly. "Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it?" Her husband interposed. "There, there, mother," he said hastily. "Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir." And he eyed the other wistfully. "I'm sorry," began the visitor. "Is he hurt?" demanded the mother wildly. The visitor bowed in assent. "Badly hurt," he said quietly, "but he is not in any pain." "Oh, thank God," said the old woman, clasping her hands. "Thank God for that. Thank—" She broke off suddenly as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the other's averted face. She caught her breath, and turning to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling old hand upon his. There was a long silence. "He was caught in the machinery," said the visitor at length in a low voice. "Caught in the machinery," repeated Mr. White in a dazed fashion. "Yes." He sat staring blankly out at the window, and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he had been wont to do in their old courting days nearly 40 years before. "He was the only one left to us," he said, turning gently to the visitor. "It is hard." The other coughed, and rising, walked slowly to the window. "The firm wished me to convey their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss," he said, without looking round. I beg that you will understand I am only their servant and merely obeying orders." There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring, and her breath inaudible. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend, the sergeant, might have carried into his first action. "I was to say that Moore and Meggins disclaim all responsibility," continued the other. "They admit no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation." Mr. White dropped his wife's hand and, rising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words, "How much?" £200, was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, put out his hands like a sightless man, and dropped, a senseless heap, to the floor. 3. In the huge new cemetery, some 2 miles distant, the old people buried their dead and came back to a house steeped in shadow and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in a state of expectation as though of something else to happen, something else which was to lighten this load, too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and expectation gave place to resignation, the hopeless resignation of the old, sometimes miscalled, apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long to weariness. It was about a week after that the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and the sound of subdued weeping came from the window. He raised himself in bed and listened. "Come back," he said tenderly. "You will be cold." "It is colder for my son," said the old woman, and wept afresh. The sound of her sobs died away on his ears. The bed was warm, and his eyes heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully, and then slept until a sudden wild cry from his wife awoke him with a start. "The paw!" she cried wildly. "The monkey's paw!" He started up in alarm. "Where? Where is it? What's the matter?" She came stumbling across the room toward him. "I want it," she said quietly. "You've not destroyed it." "It's in the parlor, on the bracket," he replied, marveling. "Why?" She cried and laughed together, and bending over, kissed his cheek. "I only just thought of it," she said hysterically. "Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?" "Think of what?" he questioned. "The other 2 wishes," she replied rapidly. "We've only had one." "Was not that enough?" he demanded fiercely. "No," she cried triumphantly. "We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly, and wish our boy alive again." The man sat up in bed and flung the bedclothes from his quaking limbs. "Good God, you are mad!" he cried aghast. "Get it," she panted. "Get it quickly, and wish, oh, my boy, my boy." Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. "Get back to bed," he said unsteadily. "You don't know what you are saying." "We had the first wish granted," said the old woman feverishly. "Why not the second?" "A coincidence," stammered the old man. "Go and get it and wish," cried his wife, quivering with excitement. The old man turned and regarded her, and his voice shook. "He has been dead 10 days, and besides I would not tell you else, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how now?" "Bring him back," cried the old woman, and dragged him toward the door. "Do you think I fear the child I have nursed?" He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the parlor, and then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before him, ere he could escape from the room, seized upon him, and he caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door. His brow cold with sweat, he felt his way round the table and groped along the wall until he found himself in the small passage with the unwholesome thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her. "Wish!" she cried in a strong voice. "It is foolish and wicked," he faltered. "Wish!" repeated his wife. He raised his hand. "I wish my son alive again." The talisman fell to the floor, and he regarded it fearfully. Then he sank, trembling, into a chair as the old woman with burning eyes walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat until he was chilled with the cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls until, with a flicker larger than the rest, it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to his bed, and a minute or two afterward the old woman came silently and apathetically beside him. Neither spoke, but lay silently listening to the ticking of the clock. A stair creaked, and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time, screwing up his courage, he took the box of matches and, striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs, the match went out, and he paused to strike another, and at the same moment a knock, so quiet and stealthy as to be scarcely audible, sounded on the front door. The matches fell from his hand and spilled in the passage. He stood motionless, his breath suspended, until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and fled swiftly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house. "What's that?" cried the old woman, starting up. "A rat," said the old man in shaking tones. "A rat. It passed me on the stairs." His wife sat up in bed, listening. A loud knock resounded through the house. "It's Herbert!" she screamed. "It's Herbert!" She ran to the door, but her husband was before her, and catching her by the arm, held her tightly. "What are you going to do?" he whispered hoarsely. "It's my boy. It's Herbert," she cried, struggling mechanically. "I forgot it was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go. I must open the door." "For God's sake, don't let it in," cried the old man, trembling. "You're afraid of your own son," she cried, struggling. "Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert. I'm coming." There was another knock, and another. The old woman, with a sudden wrench, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the landing and called after her appealingly as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back and the bottom bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. Then the old woman's voice, strained and panting. "The bolt!" she cried loudly. "Come down! I can't reach it!" But her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If he could only find it before the thing outside got in. A perfect fusillade of knocks reverberated through the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair drawn back and the door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him courage to run down to her side and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp flickering opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road.